There's always a surprise for me when I do this. So you started nothing in chapter 12, correct?
Like the first 3 pages?
So the endocrine system is something students hate. I happen to love it, okay? The endocrine system. So if you take your hand and you put it on a hot stove, what happens?
I'm gonna react.
You're going to react, and what's that reaction going to cause you to do? Jump, right? So, it is safe to say that the nervous system is a messenger system, right? We learned that way back when in Mod 1, correct? Right, guys? So, but the nervous system has what kind of a response? Fast or slow? The nervous system is fast, thank God, right? Because that warns us that, hey, you know, maybe you shouldn't have your hand on a hot stove. The endocrine system is also a messenger system, okay? So what is its function? Communication. I'm just starting from the beginning because I don't know where she left off or anything like that. If I'm repetitive or redundant, just tell me, Mrs. C, you're redundant, let's move ahead, okay? So, both systems, the nervous and the endocrine system, are responsible for communication, but the endocrine system isn't quite as fast, right? You ever hear the story of the tortoise and the hare? Right? So, you know, the hare was just click, 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 the tortoise was slow and steady. So, that's what the endocrine system does. It provides a slower and longer lasting means of communication. And how does it do that? What does it use?
Hormones.
Hormones, chemicals, hormones, yep. When we say chemicals, I think we're like, chemicals, but that's essentially what they are, right? The endocrine system is all throughout the body, everywhere, all right? So we're going to talk about the endocrine system, all right? How hormones are the main regulators in a whole, whose birthday? Happy birthday. Aw. So, hormones maintain homeostasis. What is homeostasis? So, every single thing that the body does it in order to maintain homeostasis. If you inch one little pinch out of that homeostasis, your body's going to try to pull it back into line, okay? So fluids, electrolyte, acid, bases, all have to do with hormones, okay? So if you look on page 320, and I'm going to follow along in the book, okay, if that's helpful for you guys to follow along. Side, follow along in the book, okay? So there's some major endocrine glands, all right? This one right here, the thyroid gland, okay? I no longer have a working one. So what am I on the rest of my life? Synthroid, right. So anybody who has not had children yet, you can also look forward to that, because childbirth tends to really throw off your thyroid, which is exactly what happened to me, okay? We have the adrenal glands. They're on top of the kidneys. What are they responsible for? Yeah, steroids, exactly. Ovaries and testes. Those are pretty easy. We kind of know what those are responsible for, right? The pineal, the pituitary, the thymus. Extra credit question. You can eat the thymus in some animals. What is that called?
You said you can what?
Eat the thymus in,
Eat the thymus?
in some animals. What is that called? What's that delicacy called? Sweetbreads. Sweetbreads. I never knew that until I was talking about the thymus, and the student said, "Oh, that's sweetbreads." I'm like, no, it's not bread, it's thymus. Like, no, but apparently you can. I've not been so brave.
It's called sweetbreads.
I
Sweetbreads.
thought that was brains.
Um,
Well, that's what I was told.
really? Somebody look that up.
Sweetbreads is eating brains.
Oh, Marty, check that out. And then yeah. I thought it was the thymus.
That's nasty.
I mean, I could be wrong.
Mm,
Sweetbreads, huh?
no, it's sweetbread.
It's a thymus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not brains?
No, they fry it.
Oh, goodness. Really?
Bread.
Well, I suppose you fry anything and it's okay.
Mm-hmm. They fry it
You know
and
what
it's
they do? They
breaded.
fry butter, and they also fried Kool-Aid. How do you
You
do
fried
that?
everything.
How do you fry Kool-Aid? Like, how do you fry a liquid?
Everything. Batter it up.
Like, why would somebody want
How
to
do you
eat this
batter
though?
liquid? It just becomes
You
more
make it
runny
so
batter.
You freeze it first. make the
Lamb,
ice,
cow.
And then you roll it in batter.
That is a
Beef or
very
pork?
smart thing.
We do cooking challenges at home. That's crazy.
I think you should share your results.
Doesn't that make you sick though?
I mean, physically,
So
like
true.
actually bring stuff in.
The chicken is
Makes banging fried chicken.
she do better than Popeye.
So, the hormones don't just go around doing anything with anything, right? They have to have a target cell, all right? So, the important thing, this is, I'm going right along on the pages, right? So on page 320, it talks about target cells, right? So not every cell responds to every little thing that comes along, right? But it's a target cell that responds to something specific, all right? So, how do they work? Well, there's two ways that steroids work. I'm sorry. Ugh. Hormones work. You have your steroid. We all know what steroids are, right? Anybody ever have to take them? Not that it's my business. Yeah, you're like, feel like you could eat a side of beef. And then you have your non-steroidals. So the way these work is very different. And I'm just giving you a brief overview. You don't have to know every little bit and piece of it, okay? So, a steroid hormone, now, if it says steroid, you know it's a lipid, a fat, okay? Oh. My shoulder's killing me. A steroid hormone works directly on the cell, okay? So this is just, does its work right in the cell. So this one doesn't need any help, right? No help, it just goes in, does its thing. Okay, this is on page 321, all right? Conversely, you have, and this is on the second page, oh, maybe not, keep it going, nope, back. Oh, the non-steroid hormones. You have the non-steroid hormones, which is the second messenger. So the non-steroid hormones use a middleman, okay? So a non-steroid hormone, which is generally a protein, okay, goes into the cell, and there's a kind of a diagram of it on page 321. It activates something else within the cell. The non-steroid hormone doesn't do its thing without something else doing its thing, right? So it goes into the cell, triggers something else within that cell to do something, and that causes your effect, all right? So steroid hormones do their thing, right? Non-steroid hormones have to employ a middleman. Everybody follow that? Is that easy to understand? And that's about all I'm concerned about for you knowing these, okay? Now, there are, in terms of this chapter, there's a couple things that I want you to know. But I'm going to switch around a little bit, because I think that for the purpose of this concept, working backwards a little bit is helpful, Okay, so, remember right when I started off, I said, the body is always, always, always trying to maintain what? Homeostasis. Exactly. Homeostasis. Now, homeostasis includes things we don't even think about, okay? Always these little things that happen to us in like little cues and triggers like, geez, I'm thirsty. That's a negative feedback mechanism. So there are two ways to maintain homeostasis. Number one is negative, number two is positive, okay? Kind of easy to remember. Does anybody know why? Because there's really only there's only a couple positive feedback mechanisms. The first one being childbirth, right? So if you had a question on a test that said, unless it says childbirth, that if we have a positive or negative feedback mechanism, if you don't know the answer, you got better odds if you answer what? Negative feedback, right? Because almost everything is negative, just a couple things are positive. So, on page 324, so I know I'm skipping the page in the middle, okay, but I'm doing that for a reason, all right? Because I think if you understand a feedback mechanism, you're more likely to understand the stuff on the previous page, okay? So, negative feedback means, does anybody did you guys read the chapter ahead of time? Tell me what, in your words, negative feedback means.
Causes of reverse to homeostasis.
So I think this is poorly named, because I think anytime something is named negative, we have a poor connotation of it, like, oh, negative feedback, that has to be bad. It's not. It's good in this case. Negative feedback mechanisms are good. So what they try to do is they try to return things to normal, whereas positive feedback amplifies whatever. So let's say we were thirsty, okay, and we had a positive feedback mechanism. We'd be amplifying that thirst, right, which would mean we get dehydrated. So if we're thirsty, we want a negative feedback loop to kick in so that we do what? Get a drink of water and make sure we're not thirsty anymore, right? So it talks about, on page 324, an example, and there's a nice diagram on the bottom about negative feedback, okay? So we should have a blood sugar within a normal range, correct? So negative means we do what?
Trying to get back to reverse.
We reverse the effect, right? Or we reverse that, whatever's happening. Whereas a positive means what? We amplify it, right? And again, that works in childbirth. Why? Because you start having contractions. And then when you contract, it stimulates the release of oxytocin. Oxytocin causes the uterus to contract more. So then you're contracting more, which stimulates more. And then that's when you see people screaming and yelling in pain because it hurts, right? So let's talk about blood glucose. So everybody in here hopefully has eaten something. What time is it? I don't want to get off track. Okay. Trying to see it. Mrs. Karen. One second. So, after you eat, what happens to your glucose? So, this is a negative feedback all around, right? So, you eat. So we're going to start off by eating. All right? Now, tell me why you would eat. Aside from the fact that it's good, what if you're hungry? What is hunger? Hunger is a signal, right? And the signal is, you know what, we haven't had something to eat in a while. What does the cell need to work?
Energy.
energy, and we get that energy through food, right? So you ever see that Snickers bar commercial? Right? So it's saying, you know, you're hungry, so you need to feed your body, right? So that's the whole kickoff. Or you could start at any point in the cycle. So it's hard to say we start from one spot, okay? Because I could say, well, it starts at this one spot. It can start at any part in this whole cycle. So we're hungry. So the body has said, we don't have enough energy, so we're going to trigger the sensation of hunger so that we get some nutrition, right? So we eat. Once we eat, what happens to our blood glucose? We raise our blood glucose, right? Now, when we raise our blood glucose, there's a limit to that, right? We don't want our glucoses going sky high. So someone who has good control and is eating well and all the right stuff, which myself not included whatsoever, all right, but you should have a steady level of blood glucose. When we eat, our blood glucose is going to rise a little bit, right? So when we have that increasing glucose level, your pancreas, which is a, what kind of gland? Endocrine gland, senses that, hey, glucose is rising. So what happens next? And this is really key for you to understand because you're going to be giving this all the time. What is released by the pancreas to lower blood glucose?
Insulin.
Insulin, exactly. So insulin is released. And what does insulin do? It lowers blood glucose. So I think it's important to understand how insulin works. Because if you tend to memorize these concepts, sometimes they can get a little confusing. Whereas if you truly understand a concept in the way it works, things might make a little more sense to you, right? So I'm gonna go over here where there's lots of people. Okay, so I want you to come over, John. So meet our cell. Do you mind? You're right. This is our cell, okay? And I'm glucose. I'm right here. Where should I be? I should be in the cell, right? How much good am I doing out here? I'm damaging other parts, exactly what I'm doing. You're absolutely right, damaging other parts. So, in order for the body to sense there's glucose in the system, where do I have to be? In the cell. Why aren't I there? I have too much glucose around. Why? This is the key part. Why are there 10,000 of me? That's exaggerated. Because I don't have the insulin, right? So Jennifer, not to be awkward, give me your hand. So Jennifer comes along, this is insulin. She's like, okay, glucose, I got you. Where are we gonna go? We're gonna go right to the cell here, right? So now we're inside the cell. That's how insulin works. If she said, I don't like you, glucose, I'm not helping you, then here I am, out here, all by myself, with 1,000 of my other glucose friends, right? And I'm not doing any good, because what does the brain think my sugar is? A big fat nothing, 0. Because it doesn't sense the glucose unless it's inside of that cell, okay? Without insulin, the glucose doesn't enter the cell. Can everybody understand that concept? That is the key concept, the basis of your diabetic patients, the basis of diabetic ketoacidosis, is the understanding that in one particular, there's 2 cases, but one of them is we don't have insulin, right? Generally, well, back in the day, it was pretty straightforward. Type 1, you didn't have insulin. Type 2, you did. but it wasn't really working that well, your cells were resistant. So you can say generally that type 1 diabetics produce either no insulin or next to no insulin, right? And for that reason, the glucose never gets shuttled into the cell, which means the body needs energy, right? Part of the negative feedback loop, right? So we'll go back to this negative feedback loop. We're hungry, we eat, our glucose rises, the pancreas says, it's getting a little sugary in here, right? I'm gonna release some insulin. Pancreas releases insulin, and what happens?
Sugar growth.
Your sugar level goes down, exactly. Decreased blood glucose. So, when you get a patient on the floor and you take their blood glucose and it's like 172, which just happens to be the low end of the limit for covering them, but their tray's not there yet. What do you want to do?
Hold it.
I hold it if it's right on the verge, right? Because if we give that insulin, what could happen? We could really drop their glucose. Or the tray comes, they're like, ugh. I told them 100 times, I don't like scrambled eggs. They give me this crap all the time. I'm not gonna eat it. You might as well just take it back. Well, now you've got 6 units of rapid-acting insulin on board and a patient who doesn't wanna eat. So get ready to start with the dextrose, right? Because that's what's gonna happen. So you have negative feedback loop, means you are reversing something that will alter homeostasis, okay? And then right on page 324, in the second column, just above positive feedback, it says, and I think you should highlight this, hint, hint, these responses are negative because they reverse the direction of a disturbance to the stability of the internal environment, okay? So, in this case, what have we reversed? The change in blood glucose, exactly, okay? So, that being said, as we go over to page 325, again, one more thing I want to talk about before we hit kind of the meat and potatoes and stuff, which is the previous page. So, when we teach A&P, I think it's important that you have an understanding of how the body works, because really A&P is the basis of everything, including your pharmacology, okay? But I'm not so much hung up on all this like little teeny tiny things, because what I want you to really know is how it relates to a patient that you're taking care of, right? Because when a patient is hypoglycemic and sweating and shaking, you'll be like, oh God, is this the second mechanism, messenger, is it stiff? Who cares? Nobody gives a crap, right? All you want to know is what's going on and how do we fix it, right? So, the mechanism of endocrine disease. It's very simple, really. It seems very hard, it's very simple. You have a hormone. Okay, so, in this case, our hormone is going to be insulin. There are 2 things that happen in endocrine disorders. What are they? What happens in endocrine disorders?
Something's not produced.
Okay, so too little. Or too much, right? So too much is known as hypersecretion. Too little is known as hypo. Hypo, anything hypo is like low or less. Hyposecretion. Okay, so insulin. That is our hormone. What happens with too much insulin?
Hyperglycemic?
I'm sorry?
They become hyperglycemic. You told
Hypo.
Oh, I thought you said too much insulin.
I did.
Oh, so hypo.
So how does insulin work? Let's think back to us.
It helps the sugar down.
Helps bring this right, because if it wasn't for Jennifer, I'd still be on the outside of the cell, right? Because Jennifer was insulin and I'm sugar, all right? if there's too much of her and not enough of me, where's my sugar gonna be?
Out of the cell.
Low, very, very low. Is that what you said?
No, I just said out of the cell.
In the cell.
So if it's too much sugar,
Too much insulin.
too much insulin, the sugar would be in the cell.
If there's too much insulin, you'd have more insulin than sugar. It would all be used up. Okay? It would all be used up. So can this happen? Yeah. You know what it does? When people don't pay attention to the units, or they give mLs instead of units, they give an overdose of insulin, right? Somebody with a very rapid metabolism, a diabetic who's not on schedule, took a lot of insulin, didn't eat, etc. So if I have too much, that is called what? Too much is hypersecretion. So if I have an increased amount of insulin, or I hypersecrete my insulin, is that going to affect my sodium level? Is it going to affect my because we talked about target cells, right? So is that going to affect my ovaries?
Yeah.
I mean, in a roundabout sort of way, possibly if it goes on long enough, but in the short term, no. It's going to affect glucose. Too much insulin means what? Hypoglycemia, low blood glucose. Hypoglycemia. All right, now, we have two little ones. So, I have decided that, so I was correcting care plans today at home, and Price is Right was on, because I'm old and I like that show. And they were doing a pricing game, and they had ice cream, a can of sweet potatoes, a big giant loaf of bread, ramen noodles, like everything that could be nothing but completely loaded with carbs was there. So he said, this is something that you would eat when someone breaks up with you, right? Because it's loaded with carbs, lots and lots and lots of carbs, right? So if I go ahead and I demolish everything on that stage, what's going to happen to my glucose level?
It's gonna raise.
It's going to raise, right? Hopefully, I have some insulin, a lot of insulin that I can secrete out, right? But if I don't have enough insulin, what's going to happen?
That become hypoglycemia.
Hyper.
Your blood sugar is going to go up. So it's an inverse effect. Too little insulin, too high of a glucose. Right? Too much insulin, too little glucose. So sometimes they'll say, hey, make sure you punch for me, okay? Thank you. All right. So this is an example of mechanisms of disease. There's either too much or too little of a specific hormone. It could be anything, right? But if there's, like they say, too much of a good thing isn't always a good thing, right? And too little of a good thing isn't always a good thing. So we want it to be just right. Who are the doctors that we go to? Endocrinologists. I don't envy them. They got it rough. Endocrinologists, you've got to know, like, that's like a pretty intense specialty, I think. I think it's pretty cool, but pretty intense. So, now that being said, let's turn back to page 322. So on page 322 and 323, you have all of these hormones here, right? So the glands, the hormones, and their function. And under dysfunction, you notice it only says two things, too much or too little, right? You don't see if there's just enough Because a dysfunction means something isn't working correctly. So, again, with endocrine diseases, too much or too little? Now the trick is to try to remember what some of these things are for, right? So, we already talked about insulin.
That makes sense.
I'm gonna keep this up here. What I wanna do
So
right
if
off the bat,
blood levels of the thyroids are high, that means it's hypo.
it depends on the thyroid hormone itself. So, and we'll get into that, but that's really good now, because if you have the thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, is really high, that's a bad thing. Why? Because it's sensing there's no thyroid hormone in my system, which is what happened to me. So it's gonna keep trying to make that thyroid keep stimulating the thyroid to produce thyroid hormone, and nothing's happening. So it's just dumping more and more and more and more into the system, which is useless because your thyroid doesn't work anymore, right? But that's excellent. So that is, even within sometimes these systems, there's a couple different hormones to learn. Thank you. Is I'm going to just have you guys mark off, and I'll make sure I relay this information to Mrs. Karen. And if things get a little confused maybe on the test, I will double check it, and if there's anything on here that I didn't tell you to learn, I'll mark the questions, okay? So, the hormones that I want you to know. TSH, we're right on page 322. Does everybody have their books with them? Everyone? Yeah? So Quinta, go ahead to page 322. Your book's in the
I
car?
forgot it. I grabbed my phones by accident.
Okay, so what time is it? 5:47? So this is what we'll do before we start out. Go ahead and go to everybody, go get your book. If you can grab your PN book, your ATI book, grab it as well. But just take a break. We'll go a little extra longer. We'll go till 6 o'clock. That gives you 13 minutes. Okay, and then we'll start this stuff. Sounds good.